On the afternoon of November 3rd, 1981, at approximately 3:20 local time, a 23-year-old Army Signals Intelligence Specialist named Dennis Charles Yee was seated at a monitoring console inside a low concrete building at NSA Field Station Bad Aibling, located in a valley in southern Bavaria, West Germany, approximately 60 kilometers southeast of Munich. Yee, who had been assigned to the facility for 14 months, was working a tape review shift, a routine assignment that involved listening to recorded Soviet military and intelligence communications intercepted over the preceding 48 hours and flagging any anomalies or signals of interest for senior analysts. The work was, by most measures, monotonous. Yee had processed thousands of hours of recorded communications since his arrival at Bad Aibling. The vast majority contained nothing actionable: encrypted data bursts, routine maintenance transmissions, weather communications, the ordinary operational noise of Soviet military communications infrastructure. The expectation was not that any individual tape would yield significant intelligence, but that the accumulation of monitored traffic would, over time, allow NSA analysts to map patterns, identify changes in operational tempo, and detect the kinds of deviations from established baseline behavior that trained analysts learned to recognize as potentially meaningful. The tape reel Yee was reviewing that afternoon had been recorded the previous day from a monitoring channel assigned to a Soviet communications relay station believed to be operating from within East Berlin. The channel was designated in NSA's internal classification system as a military cipher traffic lane, meaning it was expected to carry only encrypted digital data, not voice communications. When Yee heard what appeared to be a human voice embedded within the static of a data transmission, he assumed initially that he had misheard, or that his equipment was producing a minor malfunction. He rewound the tape and listened again. The sound was faint, partially buried beneath the hiss of the data stream, but unmistakable. A male voice, clearly speaking English, clearly American in accent, audible for just over 3 seconds before disappearing back into static. Yee could make out what sounded like the words "confirmed for the 14th, possibly with a syllable or two before and after, but the preceding portion was too obscured to be intelligible, and the transmission terminated abruptly after what sounded like the beginning of one additional word. Then the data channel resumed, as if nothing had happened. Yee flagged the segment, completed a signals anomaly report, and passed the tape to his shift supervisor, Sergeant First Class Michael Prater, at approximately 3:45 p.m. Prater listened, agreed that the fragment was notable, and escalated it to the station's senior civilian analyst, a 47-year-old NSA employee named Gerald Schaefer, before the end of the shift. Schaefer recognized that the audio fragment, 3 seconds and 1 fraction, according to the timestamp embedded in the recording equipment's log, was potentially significant. The voice was clearly American. The phrase "confirmed for the 14th" suggested a scheduled event, a prearranged exchange of some kind, and it had appeared within a channel that, by all technical protocol, should have carried only encrypted data, never voice. The most plausible explanation was that the speaker had inadvertently allowed a voice circuit to bleed into the data channel, a misconfigured communication switch on the Soviet side, or a momentary cross-patch between circuits made during a hasty operational transition. The fragment was copied, cataloged under the case number the anomaly report had generated, and transmitted via secure channel to NSA headquarters at Fort Meade, Maryland, where it was received on November 5th, 1981, and assigned to the agency's voice exploitation section for analysis. What followed was a process that was, in 1981, entirely manual and extraordinarily painstaking. NSA's voice exploitation section had access to a library of voice recordings associated with known and suspected intelligence personnel, recordings gathered from intercepted communications, defector debriefings, and surveillance operations conducted by the FBI and CIA. The section compared unknown voice samples against this library using spectrographic analysis, a technology that generated visual representations of a voice's unique acoustic characteristics. The problem was that 3 seconds of partially degraded audio provided very limited material for comparison. By January of 1982, the section had eliminated hundreds of recordings from their comparison set without finding a match. In February of 1982, the section submitted a formal request through counterintelligence channels for access to personnel voice recordings from other agencies, asking broadly for recordings from individuals with access to information categories relevant to KGB operations in the Washington area. The request went to the CIA's Office of Security and, after review and authorization through proper legal channels, was granted in March. The match, when it came in April of 1982, connected 3 seconds of audio from a Soviet military communications channel to a man who had been providing classified information to Soviet intelligence since 1964. His name was Harold Eugene Voss. He was 52 years old, a senior analyst in the CIA's Directorate of Intelligence, and by the time the voice analysis returned its identification, he had spent nearly 2 decades living a life divided so precisely into its visible and hidden halves that people who had worked beside him for years would describe him, in subsequent FBI interviews, as one of the most consistent and predictable people they had ever known. Before we continue, if you're drawn to the hidden history of Cold War intelligence and the human costs behind classified operations, subscribe and turn on notifications. These are the cases that defined an era, and we document them every week. Now, back to Harold Voss. Harold Eugene Voss was born on March 14, 1929, in Cincinnati, Ohio, the second child of Frederick Voss, a postal worker, and Clara Voss, née Hollenbeck, who worked part-time as a seamstress. The family lived in a modest 2-bedroom house on Fairfield Avenue in the Price Hill neighborhood, a working-class area on the city's west side populated largely by German and Irish immigrant families and their American-born children. Frederick was a reliable man of few words and strong opinions, a union member who believed in working hard, paying his debts, and staying out of other people's affairs. Clara was warmer, more outwardly affectionate, the kind of woman who remembered every birthday in the extended family and made her home available for neighborhood gatherings. Harold was, by every account from those who knew him in his youth, a thoughtful and unusually quiet child. His grammar school teachers consistently noted his aptitude for academics and his tendency to observe rather than participate, sitting at the edge of groups rather than at their center, watching other children rather than joining them. He had close friendships, but few of them, and those friendships were characterized by peers as unusually intense and loyal. He was the kind of boy who remembered what you had told him months ago and who showed up when you needed him without being asked. He attended Purcell High School, a Catholic boys' school in Cincinnati, where he first encountered Russian through a single elective course offered by a Jesuit priest named Father Raymond Kovach, who had learned the language during a missionary assignment in Eastern Europe in the 1930s. Father Kovach taught Russian not merely as a language, but as an entry point into a literature and civilization that struck the young Harold Voss as simultaneously alien and deeply human, a paradox he found more compelling than anything else in his education. In later years, in FBI debriefings and interviews with researchers, Voss returned to Father Kovach repeatedly when asked to describe the origins of his intellectual formation, attributing to the old Jesuit something he described simply as the original curiosity, the sense that the Soviet world was not simply an enemy to be opposed, but a civilization to be understood. Voss graduated from Purcell in June 1947 and enrolled at Xavier University in Cincinnati, where he studied history and Russian language. In 1950, he was drafted into the Army and served as a military intelligence specialist during the Korean War, attached to the 7th Infantry Division. His language skills made him useful for translation work involving captured documents. He was discharged in 1953 with the rank of corporal and a commendation for his work on an intelligence analysis task that his discharge papers described only in general terms. He returned to Cincinnati, completed his undergraduate degree at Xavier, and enrolled in a graduate program in Russian area studies at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. It was at Georgetown that Voss encountered the intellectual environment that would define the rest of his professional life, a community of scholars, former intelligence officers, and Cold War strategists who debated the nature of the Soviet system with the urgency of people who believed the outcomes of those debates had practical consequences for civilization. He was recruited by the CIA in 1955, before he had completed his master's degree. The approach was made by a professor who served as a non-official contact for the agency, a practice common enough in that era that it had its own informal vocabulary among graduate students. Voss's combination of language skills, military intelligence background, academic aptitude, and what his interviewing officers described as an exceptional capacity for synthesis, for drawing connections between disparate sources of information, made him an attractive candidate for analytical work in the Soviet division. He completed his training in 1956 and was assigned to the Directorate of Intelligence's Soviet Analysis Branch, where his initial responsibilities involved reviewing and synthesizing intelligence reports on Soviet military and economic capabilities. In June 1957, Harold Voss married Dorothy Ellen Harrington, a 24-year-old woman from Bethesda, Maryland, whose father worked as a federal attorney. Dorothy was, by the accounts of those who knew her, intelligent, socially adept, and possessed of a warmth and directness that complemented Harold's more reserved temperament. She had been teaching elementary school in Northern Virginia when they met, and continued teaching through the first several years of their marriage. People who worked alongside her described her as the kind of colleague who remembered which parents were going through difficult circumstances and which children needed extra patience, someone whose attention to people was not an effort but a natural orientation. The Vosses purchased a house in McLean, Virginia in 1960, a two-story colonial on a quiet street called Brayburn Lane, in a neighborhood of similar houses populated largely by government workers and their families. William Voss was born in 1959, before the house was purchased. Margaret followed in 1962. Thomas came in 1965. Dorothy stopped teaching when Thomas was born and did not return to the classroom, becoming an active participant in the life of Brayburn Lane, a volunteer at the children's schools, a member of the neighborhood association, someone who knew the names of every child on the street and the circumstances of most of the families who lived there. By the late 1960s and into the early 1970s, Harold Voss arrived at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, each morning at approximately 7:45 a.m., driving from McLean in a commute that took no more than 12 minutes. He parked in the same section of the facility's parking structure each day, a habit that colleagues occasionally noted and teased him about. He ate lunch at his desk more often than not, working through midday in a pattern that had earned him a reputation within his division for diligence. He attended staff meetings, asked measured questions, offered careful judgments, and was by the assessment of every colleague later interviewed a steady and thoroughly reliable analyst, someone who produced the work on time, who could be trusted to maintain the security protocols that classified environments demanded, and who presented, across the length of an ordinary working day, no surface that suggested anything other than what he appeared to be. His colleagues described him in terms that were strikingly consistent. He was thoughtful, private without being unfriendly, someone who listened carefully and remembered what he heard. Multiple people noted that he seemed genuinely curious about work outside his immediate responsibilities, asking questions about projects in adjacent analytical areas, expressing interest in programs that did not directly involve him. This quality was read at the time as evidence of intellectual breadth. It was assessed in retrospect as possibly reflecting his effort to understand the full scope of CIA activities relevant to his Soviet handler's interests. His children grew up on Brayburn Lane in the ordinary way of government worker suburbs in that era. William, the eldest, played Little League baseball through his early adolescence and eventually developed a strong interest in mathematics, enrolling at the University of Virginia in 1977. Margaret was more sociable, active in school drama programs, and possessed of her mother's facility for managing social situations. Thomas, the youngest, was by several accounts the most intellectually adventurous of the three. Curious about everything, prone to asking questions that resisted easy answers, and deeply attached to his father in a way that both Dorothy and Thomas himself would later describe as the central emotional fact of his childhood. Harold Voss coached Thomas's youth soccer team in the mid-1970s. He attended every one of Margaret's school performances. He drove William to Charlottesville in the fall of 1977 and helped him move into his dormitory room. By every visible measure, the life on Braeburn Lane was what it appeared to be, a functional, comfortable family whose days proceeded along a conventional arc. None of the people who shared that life with Harold Voss had any reason to look beneath the surface of it. And Harold Voss, for reasons that he would spend the rest of his life only partially understanding, had arranged it so that they would not. In September of 1963, Harold Voss traveled to Helsinki, Finland, as part of a small American delegation to an academic conference on European security issues hosted by a Finnish university. The conference was not a classified event. Voss attended as a State Department representative. Covered documentation had been prepared, as was standard practice, to conceal his CIA affiliation. He presented a paper on the superpower strategic competition and spent 3 days engaged in the kind of academic exchange that had, in that era, become one of the standard venues for Soviet-American intellectual contact. On the second evening, at a reception held at the university's main hall, Voss was approached by a man who introduced himself as Nikolai Andreevich Borodin, a senior researcher at the Institute for World Economy and International Relations in Moscow, an institution that CIA analysts knew to be closely connected to the Soviet intelligence apparatus, though it maintained a genuine academic profile. Borodin was 45 years old, heavy-set, with close-cropped gray hair, and an academic's habit of pausing before he spoke, as if considering whether his words were the most precise available. He spoke English fluently and engaged Voss in a conversation about his paper that was, by Voss's later account, the most substantively serious discussion of nuclear strategy he had encountered in years. They talked for 2 hours at the reception and continued at dinner the following evening. Borodin was not overtly political and expressed nothing that could be characterized in those early conversations as a recruitment pitch. He was engaging, knowledgeable, genuinely curious, and treated Voss's ideas with a seriousness that Voss later acknowledged he found gratifying, more gratifying than he had been willing to examine at the time. They exchanged personal addresses before the conference ended. Borodin expressed hope that they might continue corresponding. The correspondence began in October 1963 and continued, through a combination of letters sent to a post office box in New York that Voss eventually established for the purpose, and telephone contact arranged through a third party for the following year. The letters were ostensibly academic, discussions of strategic theory, arms control, the interpretation of Soviet and American intentions. They were not encrypted, not covert, and would not have appeared to any casual observer as anything other than what they purported to be. But Voss did not report the contact to his security officer at the CIA, as regulations required. He knew the contact should be reported, and that Borodin's institutional affiliation would immediately trigger a counterintelligence review that would likely terminate the correspondence and possibly damage his career. He chose not to report it. That choice, the kind of procedural failure that security officers across the intelligence community were constantly combating, was the first in a series of decisions that each seemed individually manageable, but that accumulated over the following months into a situation from which he could not extract himself without catastrophic cost. Harold Voss, in 1963, was 34 years old. He had been with the CIA for 8 years, holding the rank of GS-13 with access to classified information at the secret and top secret levels. He had been responsible at various points for preparing analytical products on Soviet military doctrine, Soviet strategic intentions, and Soviet attitudes toward nuclear arms control negotiations, work that sat at the center of American national security thinking during the height of the Cold War. He understood the shape of the Soviet threat better than most people in the United States government, and he had also developed over the preceding decade what he would later describe in his FBI debriefings as a deepening unease about the American response to that threat. This unease was not simple or easily characterized. It had developed gradually through years of reading intelligence assessments that documented in clinical detail the consequences of American policy decisions in Latin America and Southeast Asia. It was shaped by the Bay of Pigs, which he had watched unfold from within the agency with something approaching despair. It was shaped by Vietnam, whose escalation he observed with increasing alarm, and it was shaped by an intellectual framework skeptical of the binary categories of the Cold War that insisted on seeing both superpowers as products of historical forces that neither had fully chosen and neither fully controlled. He was not, in any simple sense, a communist or an ideological convert. He did not believe the Soviet Union was admirable or that its people were better served by their government, but he had developed a conviction, one that he would later acknowledge was, in retrospect, a rationalization for choices he had made for other reasons, that the Soviet-American strategic competition was dangerous in ways that neither side fully appreciated, and that information asymmetries between the two powers contributed to that danger. The approach, when it came, found him in a state of mind that made him unusually susceptible to it. In November 1964, Borodin indicated through their correspondence that he would be visiting New York for a conference and suggested they meet for dinner. The dinner took place on November 18, 1964, at a restaurant in Manhattan. Borodin arrived with a colleague he introduced only as Vladimir, a younger man who spoke less but listened carefully. By the end of the dinner, the conversation had shifted from academic exchange to something more direct. Borodin acknowledged that he was aware of Voss's actual CIA affiliation and suggested that there were people in Moscow who believed a genuine private exchange of strategic information between the two sides might help both superpowers better understand each other's actual intentions, and that such understanding might reduce the risk of the kind of miscalculation that had nearly led to nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis 2 years earlier. The argument was neither crude nor implausible. It was the argument of a skilled intelligence officer who had identified exactly which intellectual framework his target occupied. Voss, by his own later account, did not agree that night or in the weeks immediately following. He went home and spent several weeks in what he described as the most difficult deliberation of his life. He understood what was being proposed. He understood the legal consequences if he were caught. He understood what it would mean to betray the organization and the country he had served for 9 years. And then, in the early months of 1965, he began. His first communication to Soviet intelligence was a written assessment, approximately 4 pages, of American analytical thinking about Soviet strategic intentions in Central Europe. He passed it to Vladimir, whose last name he was never given and whose real identity was never established by FBI investigators, through a dead-drop arrangement in the Dupont Circle area of northwest Washington, D.C. Voss left the assessment, Vladimir, or a KGB courier, removed it, and several weeks later, $3,000 in cash appeared in the same location in a sealed envelope. He took the money. Whatever intellectual justifications he had constructed for himself in the preceding months, the stability arguments, the miscalculation arguments, the private diplomacy framework, the act of accepting payment transformed the relationship into something he could not characterize, even to himself, as anything other than what it was. He later acknowledged this in his FBI debriefings, noting that the moment he picked up the envelope was the moment he stopped being able to believe his own rationalizations. But he did not stop. That, too, he acknowledged, required an explanation that he was never fully able to provide. The 18 years of Harold Voss's operation as a Soviet intelligence asset covered some of the most consequential periods of the Cold War. He remained active through the escalation of Vietnam, through the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, through the era of détente in the early 1970s, through the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, and through the renewed tensions of the early Reagan administration. During that period, his career at the CIA continued to advance. He was promoted to GS-14 in 1968 and to GS-15 in 1974. His clearances expanded with his responsibilities until, by the mid-1970s, he had access to analytical products that encompassed not only Soviet military doctrine and strategic intentions, but assessments of specific CIA operations in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, the identities and status of human assets, the coverage and gaps in American technical collection, the analytical priorities and blind spots of the intelligence community itself. His handlers changed several times over 18 years. The dead drop locations rotated on a schedule Voss received through coded messages embedded in seemingly innocuous correspondence addressed to a post office box he maintained in Arlington under a variant of his middle name. The sites moved through Dupont Circle in the earliest period, then through northwest Washington, then into Fairfax County, and eventually to a rotating series of locations in the forested areas of northern Virginia that were favored for their combination of public accessibility and natural concealment. On a Thursday afternoon in late October of 1975, Harold Voss left the Langley campus on an extended lunch break and drove west on Route 193, then south on a secondary road that ran alongside a National Park Service property near Great Falls, Virginia. He parked in a small gravel lot that served a trailhead and walked approximately half a mile along a path that followed the contour of a ridge before descending toward a stream. The trees had reached full fall color that week, the oaks still rust and bronze, the maples largely bare, and the trail was empty on a weekday afternoon except for a pair of hikers moving in the opposite direction whom he passed without acknowledgement. He was 46 years old. He had been doing this for 10 years. The path came to a point where a cluster of large sandstone boulders extended down the slope from the tree line toward the stream bank. Voss stopped at a specific rock, the third largest, distinguished by a crack along its upper face that created a natural shelf invisible from the trail unless a person stepped off the path and looked directly down into it. He knelt as if examining his bootlace, reached into the shelf, and withdrew a small wrapped package. He stood, slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, and walked back to his car without stopping. The package contained, as he had expected, a folded sheet with a typed list of requests for his next transfer, specific program names, specific document categories, and beneath that, in a smaller envelope, $4,500 in non-sequential bills. He sat in his car for a moment before starting the engine. Then he drove back toward Langley, stopped at a grocery store on Chainbridge Road, and bought pasta, a loaf of bread, and a bottle of wine for dinner. He was home by 6:15. Thomas was 10 years old. Dorothy was in the kitchen. Margaret was upstairs finishing homework. The house smelled like garlic and something baking. He put the groceries on the counter, poured himself a glass of wine, and stood talking to Dorothy about whether the roof needed attention before winter. The package was still in his jacket pocket, hanging in the entryway closet 6 feet from where they stood. This was what 18 years looked like from the inside. Not dramatic, not furtive. 2 separate contexts, each real within its own terms, existing without apparent friction because Harold Voss had constructed, over a decade of practice, the psychological architecture required to keep them separate. He did not experience guilt in those moments, at least not in any form that surfaced into conscious awareness. He experienced the kitchen, the wine, his wife's voice, the smell of dinner. The other thing existed in a different space entirely. According to Voss's own account in his FBI debriefings, conducted between May and August of 1982, the scope of what he provided to Soviet intelligence expanded over the years, largely at the KGB's direction. The financial compensation he received over 18 years totaled approximately $187,000, modest for the level of intelligence being provided, and far below what other Cold War espionage cases would eventually reveal as standard compensation. Voss later indicated that money had never been his primary motivation, a claim that FBI investigators assessed as probably genuine, given that he had not substantially altered his lifestyle during the period. The KGB appeared to value Voss's contributions considerably more than his compensation suggested. According to the debriefing of a KGB defector in the mid-1980s, conducted after Voss's arrest and prosecution, Voss had been given a code name within the first chief directorate that translated roughly as professor, a designation that apparently reflected his handler's assessment of the quality and depth of his analytical contributions. The defector indicated that Voss's material had been used at senior levels of Soviet strategic planning, though the specific ways in which it influenced decisions were never fully established. The damage assessment conducted by CIA and FBI analysts between mid-1982 and early 1983 identified at least 14 separate CIA analytical products that Voss appeared to have compromised over the course of the operation. It concluded that his disclosures had given Soviet intelligence a detailed understanding of how American analysts assessed Soviet intentions during several critical periods, allowing Soviet planners to craft strategic communications designed to exploit American misperceptions. More critically, the assessment identified 3 human intelligence sources: CIA assets operating within the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, whose covers had been compromised and who had disappeared, been arrested, or ceased contact during periods that correlated directly with Voss's access to files referencing their operations. One of them was an electrical engineer at a defense research institute outside Leningrad who had been providing technical assessments to the CIA through a communications cutout for 3 years. He dropped out of contact in the spring of 1969 and was never heard from again. A CIA damage review completed in 1983 concluded with high confidence that his identity had been compromised from the American side. He was believed to have been executed, though Soviet records documenting this were never made available to American officials. A second individual, a mid-level official at a Warsaw Pact military liaison office in East Germany, was arrested by East German security services in 1971 under circumstances that CIA analysts assessed as consistent with the compromise of his identity. He was known to have been sentenced to a lengthy prison term, though his subsequent fate was never confirmed. The third asset remained entirely unaccounted for. Voss addressed the question of these 3 individuals during his FBI debriefings, maintaining that he had never been asked to identify assets by name and had not, to his knowledge, intentionally provided identifying information about specific individuals. FBI analysts reviewing his account in later years assessed this claim as possibly technically accurate, but almost certainly misleading. The analytical products he had provided contained enough contextual detail about source coverage and collection capabilities that a skilled Soviet analyst could have inferred significant implications for the identification of human sources even without explicit naming. The question of those 3 individuals was never fully resolved. The probable voice match between the November 1981 NSA fragment and Harold Voss's CIA personnel recordings was documented in an April 9, 1982, memorandum from NSA's Voice Exploitation Section to counterintelligence coordinators at the Signals Intelligence Directorate. The memorandum described the match as probable but not definitive. The 3 seconds of available audio and the degraded quality of the fragment meant that the comparison fell short of the threshold NSA analysts required for a confirmed identification. However, the memorandum noted that the acoustic characteristics of the unknown voice and the Voss sample overlapped in 17 of 23 measured parameters, a level of correspondence that the section assessed as highly unlikely to occur by chance across the relevant population. The memorandum was transmitted to the FBI's Counterintelligence Division on April 14, 1982. FBI Special Agent in charge Gerald Whitmore of the Washington Field Office's Soviet Counterintelligence Squad received it and described his reaction in his later account of the case as one of controlled discomfort. A probable voice match between a 3-second audio fragment of uncertain origin and a 27-year CIA veteran was not sufficient on its own to open a formal investigation, but it was more than enough to initiate what Whitmore called a preliminary assessment, an informal review of available information that did not require the legal authorizations a full investigation would demand, and that could be conducted without triggering notification requirements that might alert CIA leadership to the FBI's suspicions before those suspicions were substantiated. The preliminary assessment took 6 weeks. FBI analysts reviewed Voss's publicly available financial records, his travel history as reflected in State Department passport records, and his employment timeline as it appeared in records the CIA had previously provided the Bureau on other matters. The analysis produced no dramatic findings. No sudden unexplained wealth, no travel to Soviet-controlled countries outside officially sanctioned government business, No discrepancies between his visible lifestyle and his documented income, but the absence of obvious indicators was itself consistent with a sophisticated long-term operation managed by professional handlers who had been careful for nearly 2 decades. On May 28, 1982, the FBI opened a formal counterintelligence investigation of Harold Eugene Voss under the code name GRAYSTONE. The investigation was authorized at the highest levels within the Bureau and handled with extreme compartmentalization. Fewer than a dozen people were initially informed of its existence. The CIA's Office of Security was informed only at the level necessary to quietly monitor Voss's access to classified materials without his knowledge. The notification was made, according to later accounts, by FBI Director William Webster, directly to CIA Director William Casey, in a meeting that left both men, according to a participant who subsequently described it, visibly shaken by the implications of what they were being told. The surveillance of Voss began on June 1, 1982, a Tuesday. FBI agents established observation of the Braeburn Lane residence before 6:00 a.m., documenting his morning routine as he prepared to leave for work. They followed his drive to Langley, noting the route and any unusual variations. They documented his lunch excursions, which occurred several times per week, his weekend routines, and his interactions with neighbors and family. For the first 3 weeks, Voss's behavior was entirely conventional. He drove to work, returned home, completed weekend errands, attended a neighborhood gathering in mid-June, and drove Thomas, who was then 17 and researching colleges, to visit the campus of the University of Maryland. Nothing in his observed behavior suggested awareness of surveillance, and nothing indicated the active tradecraft of an intelligence operative managing a live operation. On June 22, 1982, Voss took a personal day from work. He left his house at 9:15 a.m. and drove north on Route 123 toward Maryland. FBI surveillance vehicles followed at a distance. He drove to a shopping center in Bethesda, parked, and entered a hardware store. He spent approximately 20 minutes inside and emerged carrying a small paper bag. He then drove to a residential neighborhood in Chevy Chase, Maryland, parked on a quiet street, and sat in his car for approximately 8 minutes without exiting. Then he left the vehicle and began walking along the sidewalk. He walked 3 blocks, turned east on a side street, and entered a small city park, a half-block green space with a few benches and a walking path that looped around a cluster of oak trees. He walked the loop once, slowly, pausing to examine what appeared to be a loose board on one of the park benches. On his second loop, he stopped at that bench and reached underneath it briefly with his right hand, a motion that 2 FBI agents following on foot documented but could not photograph clearly, then continued walking back to his car and drove home without further stops. FBI agents who moved through the park immediately after Voss's departure found, beneath the bench, an empty cavity where the loose board created a natural hiding space. There was nothing inside it, but the specific action, reaching beneath a specific bench in a specific park on a personal day, was documented in the surveillance report as potentially significant, exactly the kind of subtle, plausibly deniable activity that trained intelligence officers used when checking or establishing a dead drop location. 5 days later, on June 27, 1982, Voss repeated the drive to the same park. He walked the loop only once. When he reached the bench, he paused for approximately 30 seconds. When FBI agents examined the bench cavity immediately after his departure, they found a small, tightly wrapped package approximately the size of a thick envelope, sealed with several layers of tape. Under a court order obtained the same afternoon, FBI technical agents examined the package without disturbing its external appearance. It contained 3 rolls of 35mm microfilm and a handwritten note written in cipher. The microfilm was later determined to contain photographs of CIA analytical documents that Voss had accessed through his work terminal over the preceding 2 weeks. The handwritten note, once decoded by FBI cryptanalysts, contained a request to his handler for a meeting confirmation and a notation about the document's contents. The package was carefully resealed and returned to the bench cavity. On July the 3rd, 1982, a man who had not previously appeared in the surveillance operation entered the park at approximately 11:20 a.m. He was later identified from surveillance photographs as Gennady Pavlovich Orlov, a 44-year-old cultural attaché at the Soviet embassy in Washington, whom the FBI's Soviet counterintelligence squad had previously assessed based on other operations as a KGB officer operating under diplomatic cover. Orlov walked directly to the bench, spent approximately 15 seconds examining the area around it, retrieved the package, and left the park. He drove directly toward the Soviet embassy without making additional stops. The FBI now had documentation of a complete operational cycle, Voss preparing and placing classified materials at a dead drop site, and a known KGB officer retrieving those materials. The legal case for arrest was strong, and the ongoing damage being caused by Voss's continued access to classified materials was judged sufficient to override any remaining investigative value in extending the surveillance further. The decision to arrest was made in late July 1982. On the morning of September 14, 1982, FBI agents arrived at the Voss residence on Brayburn Lane in McLean, Virginia, at 6:30 a.m. Harold Voss was in the kitchen, dressed for work, drinking coffee. Dorothy was upstairs. Thomas, who was beginning his senior year of high school, was in his room. According to the lead agent's arrest report, Harold Voss was informed that he was under arrest for conspiracy to commit espionage and for unauthorized transmission of national defense information to a foreign government. He set his coffee cup down on the kitchen counter, very carefully, and did not speak. He was handcuffed and led to an FBI vehicle in the driveway. Dorothy Voss had come downstairs when she heard voices. She stood in the kitchen doorway wearing a housecoat and watched as her husband was led toward the front door. The lead agent's report noted that she did not ask any questions and did not attempt to interfere. She appeared, in the agent's description, to be experiencing what the report characterized as a quiet absence, as if she had not fully processed what she was witnessing, as if the images in front of her had not yet connected to the life she had understood herself to be living. Thomas appeared at the top of the stairs as agents were completing the initial processing of the first floor. He was 17 years old. He saw his father being led through the front door in handcuffs and called out a single word, "Dad," that received no response because Harold Voss was already outside and the door had been closed. According to Thomas Voss, in interviews he gave years later to researchers studying the long-term impacts of parental espionage, arrests on families, that single unanswered word was the last thing he said to his father that felt like ordinary communication between two people who fully understood what they meant to each other. A search of the Voss residence, conducted under warrant on the same day, produced materials that expanded the prosecution's evidence significantly. In a locked filing cabinet in Harold's home office, agents found a Minox camera of a type commonly used for document photography, an encryption guide written in a combination of numbers and characters that FBI cryptanalysts would spend 3 weeks decoding, approximately $31,000 in cash in a shoebox stored at the back of a closet shelf, and a collection of handwritten notes in Russian that appeared to be operational communications from Voss's handlers over a period of years. Dorothy Voss was interviewed by FBI agents at the residence on September 14th and again 2 days later. She was never charged with any crime. Investigators concluded that she had no knowledge of her husband's activities, a conclusion supported by the operational security of the arrangement, which had been carefully designed so that nothing visible in their domestic life would suggest anything other than Harold's routine CIA work. In one exchange documented in FBI interview notes, she was asked whether Harold had ever discussed his work in any way that seemed unusual. She said that he almost never discussed his work at all, that she had long ago understood this as characteristic of people who worked in classified environments, and that she had never had any reason to question it. Her statement was assessed as truthful. Harold Voss was formally charged on September 17, 1982, before a federal magistrate in the Eastern District of Virginia with 2 counts of espionage under 18 U.S.C. Paragraph 794, unauthorized transmission of national defense information to a foreign government. and with conspiracy to commit espionage. The charges carried a combined maximum sentence under the statutes as they existed in 1982 of life imprisonment. Voss was represented by a prominent Washington defense attorney named Bernard Ashcraft, who had experience with national security cases and who advised his client, in consultations during the weeks following the arrest, that the government's evidence was extensive and that the most realistic path forward involved cooperation. Voss agreed, or the debriefing process began in October 1982 and continued for nearly a year, conducted by a team of FBI counterintelligence agents and CIA officers working under legal arrangements designed to manage the complex situation of the CIA reviewing one of its own employees' espionage disclosures. The debriefings produced hundreds of hours of recorded testimony and thousands of pages of transcribed material. During them, Voss provided what investigators later assessed as a largely accurate account of his 18 years of activity. The identities of the handlers he had known, the locations of dead drop sites he had used, the methods of communication employed, and the specific materials he had passed to Soviet intelligence. The Soviet diplomats identified as connected to the operation, including Gennady Orlov, who had collected the Chevy Chase Park dead drop, were declared persona non grata by the State Department and expelled from the United States in September and October of 1982. Under their diplomatic status, they could not be arrested or prosecuted under American law. They returned to the Soviet Union, and their subsequent careers were not well documented in records available to Western analysts. In March of 1983, Harold Voss appeared before Judge Howard Calvert of the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia and entered guilty pleas to both espionage counts and the conspiracy charge. Prosecutors recommended a sentence of 35 years in recognition of the assistance Voss had provided during the debriefing process. Judge Calvert's sentencing remarks, delivered on May 18, 1983, were measured and thorough. He acknowledged the length of the operation, the sophisticated compartmentalization that had allowed it to continue undetected for 18 years, and the damage assessment that documented its consequences. He noted that intellectual rationalization for serious crimes was not equivalent to mitigation, and that the gap between what Voss had believed he was doing and what he had actually done was a gap that had cost other people enormously, including people who had never been in a position to make any choice at all in the matter. He sentenced Harold Voss to 40 years in federal prison. The additional 5 years beyond the prosecution's recommendation reflected his assessment that Voss's cooperation, however genuine, had been provided in circumstances that left him with few alternatives, making it less mitigating than cooperation offered when the accused still had more to lose by providing it. Voss was transported to the United States Penitentiary in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, to begin his incarceration. The years that followed were lived by the people who had surrounded Harold Voss's double life in ways that differed fundamentally from anything those years should otherwise have contained. Dorothy Voss spent the months after her husband's arrest in a state that people who knew her described as not so much grief as dissolution. The frameworks through which she had understood her marriage, her family, and her own life, 25 years of frameworks carefully constructed and maintained, had been revealed as substantially false, and the process of rebuilding her understanding of what her life had actually been was one for which there was no adequate preparation. She remained in the house on Brayburn Lane for approximately 8 months after the arrest before she became unable to manage the daily encounter with a structure that documented in every corner and detail a domestic life built on a foundation she had not known was there. She sold the house in June of 1983 and moved to a smaller apartment in Falls Church, Virginia, closer to her sister. She returned to teaching by September of that year, a decision that those who knew her described as the thing that kept her moving forward, providing structure and purpose and an environment in which the only thing that mattered was the work in front of her and the children who needed it. She visited Harold in prison once, in the spring of 1984. The visit lasted approximately 90 minutes. No account of what was said between them was ever provided publicly by either party. A year after that visit in 1985, Dorothy filed for divorce. The proceedings were uncomplicated legally and were finalized in August of that year. She reverted to her maiden name, Dorothy Harrington, and did not remarry. She retired from teaching in 1995 and lived quietly in Northern Virginia for the rest of her life, declining all requests from journalists or researchers to discuss her former husband's case. She died on March the 3rd, 2009, at the age of 76. William Voss, the eldest child, was 23 and employed as a computer programmer in Charlottesville when his father was arrested. By multiple accounts, his response was one of deliberate compartmentalization. He processed the information, made the necessary adjustments to his understanding of his father and his family history, and moved forward with what could be characterized as a conscious refusal to allow the event to define the rest of his life. He did not attend his father's trial, though he was present in the back of the gallery on the day of sentencing. He visited his father in prison 3 times over the course of Harold's incarceration, visits that he described in a single interview given years later as necessary but not healing. He eventually married, had 2 children of his own, and built a career and family life. He protected carefully from the public dimensions of the Voss case. Margaret Voss was 20 years old and in her second year at the University of Virginia when her father was arrested. She failed 2 courses in the fall semester of 1982 and spent the following spring semester on medical leave, managing what university health records documented as severe anxiety. She returned to the university the following year and completed her degree in 1986. In interviews she gave years later, Margaret described the period following her father's arrest as one in which she had profound difficulty trusting her own perceptions of people, a difficulty she attributed directly to the experience of discovering that someone she had known intimately had been leading a concealed life of significant consequence for her entire conscious memory. She became, in adulthood, a social worker specializing in family trauma, a professional choice whose connection to her own history she acknowledged openly when discussing it with people she trusted. Thomas Voss visited his father at the United States Penitentiary in Lewisburg for the last time in the fall of 1988, approximately 5 years into Harold's sentence. Thomas was 23 years old. He had driven from Arlington, Virginia, arriving at the facility in the early afternoon. He described the visiting room in later accounts as a large fluorescent-lit space, with the bolted plastic chairs and a concrete floor, the kind of institutional environment that made every human interaction inside it feel provisional, as if nothing said there could fully count. Harold was 59 years old by then, and the 5 years of incarceration had marked him visibly. His hair had gone entirely gray. He moved with a careful deliberateness that suggested chronic pain. The quality of his attention, which Thomas had remembered as one of the defining characteristics of his father, seemed to have narrowed. He was still present, still listening carefully, but the range of what he seemed to be attending to had contracted. They talked for 2.5 hours. Most of the conversation covered ordinary logistics, whether Thomas had enough money, whether his apartment in Arlington was adequate, whether he had decided on a direction for his studies. Then, toward the end of the visit, Thomas asked his father the question he had been carrying since the morning of September 14th, 1982, when he had stood at the top of the stairs and watched Harold led out the door in handcuffs. He asked Harold what he had been thinking, not at the beginning, not during the Helsinki conference or the Manhattan dinner, but in the ordinary years, when Thomas had been 9 and 10 and 11 years old, and Harold had been coaching his soccer team and attending his school performances and helping with homework, while simultaneously passing classified intelligence assessments to Soviet handlers through dead drop locations in the Virginia woods. What had Harold been thinking during those years, when the 2 halves of his life had coexisted so cleanly that nothing visible had separated them? Harold was quiet for a long time. He looked at his hands on the table. Then he said that he had not been thinking, not in the way Thomas meant. He said that compartmentalization, as he had come to understand it, was not a conscious effort. It was not the case that he had thought about one thing and then deliberately suppressed another. It was more that the 2 contexts had occupied genuinely separate cognitive spaces, the way a person could drive a familiar route home without conscious attention and arrive safely without any real memory of the journey. He said this was not an excuse. He said it was the most honest description he could offer. Thomas listened and did not respond immediately. After a moment, he said that it was the most frightening thing his father had ever said to him, not because it was a lie, he believed it was the truth, but because if it was true, then his father had not fully known what he was doing to them, and that meant there had been no point at which Harold had made a choice in full awareness of what he was choosing to destroy, which meant the family Harold had loved and the operation he had maintained alongside it had coexisted not through suppression but through genuine psychological separation, and that made the destruction of that family feel less like the consequence of a decision than the consequence of a condition. Conditions, unlike decisions, did not resolve into accountability in any way Thomas knew how to use. Harold did not respond. He looked at his son across the plastic table in the fluorescent visiting room and said nothing, which Thomas later described as the most honest response his father could have given. Thomas drove home to Arlington that evening. He did not return to Lewisburg. Harold Voss, under the sentencing guidelines and parole regulations applicable to cases sentenced before the Sentencing Reform Act of 1984 took effect, became eligible for parole after serving approximately one-third of his sentence. He was denied at his first hearing in 1996, largely on the grounds that questions about the 3 compromised CIA assets remained unresolved. He was denied again at his second hearing in 1999. He was granted parole at his third hearing in 2002 and was released from Lewisburg in January of 2003. He had served 20 years of his 40-year sentence. He was 73 years old. He moved to a small apartment in a retirement community in the Shenandoah Valley, Virginia, a location chosen partly for its distance from Washington, and partly, he told a researcher in 2006, because the landscape, the Blue Ridge visible from his window, gave him something he described simply as quiet, a word he used in a way that suggested he understood its inadequacy for what he actually meant. A researcher named Carolyn Metz, who was writing a study of long-term Cold War espionage operations and their human consequences, conducted 3 extended interviews with Harold Voss between 2006 and 2008. In the first, conducted in March of 2006, Voss was asked directly whether he believed his espionage had served any of the purposes he had used to rationalize it at the beginning. He was quiet for a long time before answering. He said that he had genuinely believed, that providing Soviet intelligence with accurate American analytical assessments would reduce the risk of miscalculation, that if Soviet planners understood American intentions more clearly, the probability of a catastrophic misread would decrease. He said he had believed this in 1964, but he said that what he understood now, which he had not understood then, was that this belief had never been a moral position. It had been a way of framing a decision he had already made for other reasons into language that sounded principled. What he had actually been drawn to, he said with evident difficulty, was the feeling of being valued by people who took his ideas seriously in a way that distinguished their attention from the institutional attention he received at work. He had been drawn to the secrecy itself, to the sense of significance that came from occupying a position no one else knew he occupied. He said this not as a confession designed to elicit sympathy, but as an observation about himself that had taken him a very long time to arrive at, and that he found, in 2006, neither surprising nor forgivable. Harold Eugene Voss died on February 7, 2011, in his apartment in the Shenandoah Valley at the age of 81 of cardiac failure early in the morning. The discovery was made by a staff member at the retirement community who had not seen him at breakfast. His obituary in the local newspaper listed his birth date, his death date, his military service in Korea, and his survivors: William Voss of Charlottesville, Virginia, Margaret Voss Thornton of Alexandria, Virginia, and Thomas Voss of Arlington, Virginia. It made no mention of his CIA career or his espionage conviction. All 3 children attended the funeral service, which was held at a small chapel near the retirement community and attended by fewer than 20 people, mostly staff members who had known him in his final years and for whom his biography was either unknown or had ceased to be the defining fact about him. Dennis Yee, who left the Army in 1984 and spent his subsequent career in telecommunications, gave an interview in 2009 to Carolyn Metz, He recalled the November 1981 tape review shift with a clarity that suggested the event had stayed with him across the intervening years. He remembered rewinding the tape, remembered the specific quality of the voice fragment, the accent, the cadence, the specific words, and remembered the mixture of uncertainty and what he described as professional instinct that had led him to flag it, rather than log it as equipment noise and move on. He said he had not been aware of the full significance of the fragment until Metz contacted him. He had followed the Voss case when it became public, had connected it to the fragment, and had felt, in a way he found difficult to articulate, the particular weight of understanding that a routine decision made in a small and unglamorous moment had contributed to consequences that extended far beyond anything visible in that moment. Gerald Schaefer, the NSA civilian analyst who had escalated the fragment from Yee's initial anomaly report, retired from NSA in 1990. He provided a brief written statement through his attorney in 1984, when the public aspects of the Voss case were first being documented, confirming the sequence of events, and noting only that his assessment of the fragment as significant had been based on standard protocol, and that the outcome demonstrated the importance of maintaining that protocol even when any individual anomalies seemed unlikely to matter. The Soviet side technical error that had produced the fragment, the misconfiguration that had allowed Voss's voice to bleed into a data-only monitoring channel, was never definitively traced or explained in publicly available materials. Intelligence analysts reviewing the case in later years assessed it as most likely a hasty reconnection of equipment by a KGB communications officer who had been switching circuits and had failed to fully isolate the voice channel before resuming the data transmission. It was, in other words, a human error of the most ordinary kind, the kind of small, pressured, inattentive mistake that people make dozens of times each day in ordinary work environments, and that in this particular context, on this particular afternoon in 1981, had produced 3 seconds of audio that ended an 18-year intelligence operation and sent a man to prison for 20 years. The Voss case raises questions that do not have simple answers, and that the passage of time has not made more tractable. It raises questions about how individuals come to make choices that they understand, at some level, to be catastrophically wrong, and what combination of rationalization, compartmentalization, and self-deception makes those choices possible to sustain not for days or months, but for years and decades. Harold Voss was not a cynical operator who consciously decided to betray his country for money or personal advancement. He was a thoughtful person who had developed a genuine, if ultimately self-serving, intellectual framework for understanding what he was doing as something other than what it was, and who had allowed that framework to support choices whose full consequences he could not bring himself to fully imagine until it was far too late. The system he operated within, the Cold War intelligence apparatus, with its culture of compartmentalization, its enormous quantities of classified information, its structural reliance on the loyalty and integrity of individuals with broad access, created conditions in which a sophisticated actor could sustain a double existence for a very long time before any single piece of evidence aligned the available information into an actionable pattern. The 3-second audio fragment was not the product of a targeted operation against Harold Voss. It was the product of a communications error on the Soviet side, captured by routine collection, preserved by protocol, escalated by attentiveness, and eventually identified through a methodical comparison process that only reached Voss because every other possibility had been exhausted first. 18 years of espionage were ended by a technical accident that could have been inaudible, could have been dismissed as static, could have been lost at any one of dozens of bureaucratic handoffs, and was not. Dorothy Harrington built a life after her marriage ended. She taught children who knew nothing about her history and did not need to. She died without having spoken publicly about what had happened to her, which was her right and which may also have been the only form of control available to her over something she had not caused and could not have prevented. Thomas Voss teaches history to high school juniors and seniors. He teaches the Cold War. He teaches the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin Wall, the arms race, and the intelligence operations that ran beneath the visible surface of those events. He does not tell his students what he knows about those events from his own family's history. He does not need to. The events themselves are sufficiently complex and consequential to generate, in 17-year-olds who are paying attention, exactly the kinds of questions that do not have easy answers, about loyalty and rationalization, about the human cost of decisions made in analysis offices and wooded park trails and fluorescent lit visiting rooms, and about what it cost the people who had no choice in any of it. Harold Voss was 35 years old when he made his first dead drop in Dupont Circle. He was 53 when he was arrested. He was 73 when he was released. He was 81 when he died alone in a retirement apartment in the Shenandoah Valley, with the Blue Ridge visible from his window, having spent the last years of his life reading and carrying, with the flat and exhausted precision he had once described to a researcher, the full weight of what he had done and could not undo. And in between those ages, the life he had built, the house on Brayburn Lane, the Saturday soccer coaching, the college move-in days, the 25 years of marriage, the sense of himself as someone whose work had meaning beyond the harm it caused, all of it had been destroyed by choices he had made and never fully understood, and by 3 seconds of his own voice captured on a November afternoon in Bavaria by a signal specialist following protocol. 3 seconds of audio. 18 years. A family on a quiet street in McLean, Virginia, that would spend decades rebuilding itself around an absence it had not created and could not fully explain. These things are connected by the choices of one man and by the systems that made those choices possible, and by a communications error on a Tuesday afternoon in East Berlin that nobody on the Soviet side ever knew had happened until it was already too late.